They kicked a poor old lady at the bank, and what happened next shocked everyone beyond belief. But before we begin, tell me, from which beautiful country of the world are you watching this story? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what you are about to hear will keep you glued till the very end. The story began on an ordinary morning, in a city that pulsed with noise, ambition, and money. The streets were alive with rushing cars, honking horns, and people chasing the endless race of survival. Hidden among them was a frail old woman, her back bent slightly with age, her clothes torn and faded from years of wear. She walked slowly, clutching a worn leather bag that looked as though it had survived decades of storms. Her hair, silver and tangled, fell across her wrinkled face, but her eyes held a depth that no one bothered to notice. That morning, she pushed open the grand glass doors of a bank. The building stood like a fortress of wealth, polished marble floors gleaming under the lights, walls adorned with paintings, and the air filled with the faint hum of money machines counting bills. Everyone inside, the security guards, the staff, the customers in crisp suits, fit the atmosphere of luxury. Everyone except her. The moment she stepped inside, silence fell for a split second, broken by whispers and stares. People glanced at her with disdain, some stepping aside as if her poverty might contaminate them. She approached the counter slowly, her trembling hands pulling a small slip of paper from her bag. Her voice, weak but steady, asked for help. She wasn't begging for money, she wanted assistance with her account, something she could not manage on her own. But instead of kindness, cruelty struck like lightning. The teller, a young man with arrogance stitched into his smile, sneered at her appearance. His words, sharp and dripping with mockery, spread through the room like poison. Soon, another staff member joined in, dismissing her as a nuisance, a burden, someone unworthy of their time. Their tone grew louder, attracting the eyes of customers who began to smirk or shake their heads. And then it happened. The unthinkable. A security guard, impatient with her presence, forcefully grabbed her arm. She tried to explain, her voice breaking, but no one listened. He shoved her toward the door. Her frail body stumbled, and she fell hard against the cold marble floor. Gasps echoed in the room, but no one moved to help her. She was kicked out, humiliated, and left trembling on the pavement outside, her bag spilling open to reveal old papers fluttering in the wind. For a moment, the city around her kept moving, indifferent to her suffering. The people inside the bank returned to their transactions as though nothing had happened. Yet outside, she sat in silence, clutching her papers with shaking hands. Her face showed not just pain, but something else, something deeper. Behind those tired eyes, a storm was brewing, a storm no one could have imagined. Because what the bank staff didn't know was that this fragile-looking woman wasn't who she appeared to be. Beneath those shabby clothes, behind that weathered face, hid a secret so powerful that within minutes, their laughter would turn to terror, and their arrogance to regret. As she slowly stood, brushing the dust from her clothes, her gaze lingered on the towering building she had just been thrown out of. There was no anger on her face, only a strange calmness, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. She walked to the edge of the street and paused, her hand dipping back into her worn bag. From inside she pulled out something that would change everything, a folded document, official, stamped, undeniable. The truth about who she really was about to surface. But no one was ready for it. And so, the day that began with laughter at a poor old lady was about to become the day the bank staff would never forget. A lesson in humility was about to unfold, one that would remind everyone that appearances are deceiving, and arrogance can destroy in an instant. The marble floors inside still glistened. The staff carried on, unaware that their world was about to turn upside down. Outside, the old lady, steadying herself, prepared to step back inside, not as a victim, but as someone with unimaginable power. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. And the storm was ready to break. The old lady stood on the steps of the bank, her frail body still aching from the shove that had thrown her to the ground. People passed her by, barely glancing, their faces cold and indifferent. In the distance, the city hummed with life, but here, in this moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She clutched the folded document tightly in her hand, her eyes narrowing with determination. What had just happened inside would not be forgotten, nor forgiven. She looked down at her wrinkled hands, marked by time and hardship, then turned her gaze back toward the glittering glass doors of the bank. To everyone else, she was a nobody, an old woman dressed in rags, a burden on society. But in truth, she was far more powerful than anyone inside that building could imagine. She had built her life brick by brick, endured storms and betrayals, and hidden her wealth from those who would only seek to use it. Today, she had entered the bank not just to test the system, but to test the people who worked within it. And they had failed. Miserably. Slowly, she straightened her posture. The fragile figure that had been thrown out moments ago now stood taller, her eyes sharper. The disguise of weakness was beginning to fall away. She stepped back inside, her feet echoing against the marble floor, drawing confused glances from the staff who thought they had rid themselves of her. The guard who had shoved her frowned, his arrogance unchanged, but unease flickered across his face. The old lady walked with quiet authority to the center of the bank lobby. She unfolded the document in her hand, its official seal glinting under the lights. Customers and clerks turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. The teller who had mocked her moments earlier froze, his smirk fading as he caught sight of the paper. There was something about her presence now, something commanding, something that silenced the whispers around the room. The document revealed what no one had expected. She was not a poor wanderer looking for sympathy. She was, in fact, the rightful owner of the very bank they worked in, a woman of immense wealth who had chosen to live humbly and quietly, away from the greedy eyes of society. The marble floors they boasted of, the walls they decorated with pride, the very salaries they collected, every bit of it existed because of her. Shock rippled through the room like a sudden storm. Mouths fell open, and eyes widened in disbelief. The same guard who had shoved her out now stood frozen, his arrogance crumbling into fear. The teller who had insulted her felt his legs weaken beneath him. The room that once echoed with laughter at her expense was now filled with a suffocating silence. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to demand. Her very presence was enough. Every second that passed was a reminder of their cruelty. Every breath they took under her gaze was a weight pressing down on their souls. The humiliation they had forced upon her moments ago now turned back upon them with a force they could not bear. The customers who had watched silently, some even smirking, now looked ashamed. They shifted uncomfortably, realizing that they, too, had judged her without mercy. The lesson was sinking in, sharp and unrelenting. Never judge a soul by its appearance. Yet the old lady was not done. She moved slowly through the room, her footsteps calm, deliberate, almost regal. She paused near the counter, letting her hand brush the smooth surface that had moments earlier been a barrier of rejection. She studied the faces before her, faces once twisted with scorn, now pale with dread. Behind her calm expression burned a storm of emotions, sadness at the cruelty of mankind, disappointment at their shallow values, but also strength, a strength born of a lifetime of struggle. She had not revealed her identity for revenge alone, but for a lesson. A lesson that needed to be seared into their hearts forever. And then, with quiet authority, she made her next move. She reached into her bag and pulled out another set of documents, these far more powerful than the first. They weren't just proof of ownership, they were instructions, papers that held the future of the bank in her hands. What she was about to do would decide the fate of those who had mocked her. The staff watched with bated breath, their hearts pounding. Would she fire them on the spot? Would she shut down the entire branch? Would she expose their cruelty to the world beyond these walls? No one knew, but every passing second tightened the grip of fear around their throats. The old lady's eyes, sharp and glimmering with hidden strength, lifted toward the trembling staff. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and the once powerless had become the absolute authority. But just as she prepared to reveal the contents of the second document, something unexpected happened. The heavy wooden doors of the bank opened, and a figure stepped inside. Tall, dressed in an immaculate black suit, his presence commanded instant respect. He was no ordinary man. He was the regional director of the bank, a man whose authority reached far beyond this branch. The staff's relief was visible. Perhaps he would save them. Perhaps he would silence the old woman. Perhaps he would restore the order they were so desperate to cling to. But as he walked closer, his eyes fixed firmly on her, something strange flickered across his face. Not confusion, not anger, but recognition. He knew her. And in that instant, the entire bank realized the nightmare was only just beginning. The atmosphere inside the bank had shifted into something almost unbearable. Just moments earlier, arrogance had ruled the air, staff mocking, customers smirking, a guard using brute force to dismiss an old woman they thought beneath them. But now, with a few pieces of paper and an unwavering gaze, everything had turned upside down. And then came the man in the black suit. The regional director's polished shoes echoed against the marble floor as he strode forward. His presence was like a blade cutting through the silence. The staff, who had moments ago held their heads high in smug superiority, now lowered their eyes, their pride collapsing into fear. He stopped only a few feet away from the old lady. The crowd watched in stunned silence, waiting for his judgment. But instead of speaking to the staff or demanding explanations, his gaze lingered on her face. His expression shifted, recognition, respect, and even a trace of unease. For years, the old woman had lived in anonymity. Her wealth, her influence, her ownership of this very bank, she had hidden it carefully, revealing nothing to the world. But the director knew her story. He knew the power she carried, the history buried beneath those wrinkled hands, and the empire built from her sacrifices. The staff's confusion grew as they noticed his subtle change in demeanor. Why was the regional director, a man feared across the banking world, standing before her as if in the presence of someone far greater? Why did his confident expression falter under her gaze? The truth was simple, yet devastating. The woman they had humiliated wasn't just the owner of their branch. She wasn't even just a wealthy figure hiding behind plain clothes. She was one of the founding members of the bank itself, a silent architect of its empire, a name that once carried weight across nations but had long been forgotten by the younger generation. And now, here she stood, reduced to a beggar in their eyes, until the mask slipped away. The regional director cleared his throat, his voice heavy with restraint, as though he feared speaking too quickly. His words were formal, reverent. The staff leaned closer, straining to hear, their hearts sinking with every syllable. The truth fell like a thunderclap. She had built the foundations of this institution decades ago, invested her fortune into its rise, and eventually retreated into the shadows to live in simplicity. Every teller, every clerk, every manager standing in that lobby owed their careers, their salaries, their very livelihoods to her. And yet, they had treated her as if she were less than human. The shock spread like wildfire. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, ashamed of the way they had silently watched her humiliation. The guard who had shoved her to the ground now trembled, his hand twitching by his side, as if wishing he could turn back time. The teller who had sneered at her appearance felt the weight of the entire world crashing on his shoulders. The old lady remained silent, her expression calm but unreadable. Her silence spoke louder than any accusation. It was not anger that burned in her eyes, but disappointment. And that disappointment cut deeper than rage ever could. The regional director turned toward the staff, his face hardening. Though he had not raised his voice, the weight of his words pressed down like iron. Their cruelty had not only shamed themselves but the entire institution. They had forgotten the very principles upon which the bank had been built: dignity, service, and respect for all, regardless of appearance or wealth. Fear settled into every corner of the room. The employees knew their fates now rested entirely in her hands. Would she forgive? Would she destroy their careers? Would she strip them of everything they had taken for granted? The old lady stepped forward once more, lifting the second set of documents in her trembling hand. The seal glinted under the golden lights of the lobby, and every eye followed it with dread. These papers were more than proof of ownership. They contained decisions that could end careers in an instant. She opened the folder, flipping through the pages slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the silence that enveloped the room. The director's eyes followed every movement, his respect growing with each turn of the page. The staff's breaths grew shallow, their hearts pounding like drums of war. And then, without a word, she closed the folder again. The suspense was suffocating. No one dared to speak, no one dared to move. It was as though time itself had frozen, waiting for her judgment. But before the silence could shatter, another sound pierced the room, the faint buzz of a phone vibrating. The director checked his device, his face paling at the message that appeared. The timing was eerie, almost fated. News had already spread. Outside the bank, cameras had gathered. Someone, perhaps a passerby, had recorded the cruel scene of an old woman being thrown to the ground. The video was already circulating, reaching thousands, spreading outrage like wildfire. The world beyond the glass doors was learning the truth before the bank itself could even react. And in the middle of it all stood the old lady, the symbol of a story that was no longer just about her, but about society itself. The director lifted his eyes from the screen, his voice low but urgent. The bank was no longer dealing with a private shame. It was now facing a public storm that could ruin its reputation across the nation. The consequences of their cruelty would not remain hidden. The staff's panic grew. They imagined the headlines, the angry mobs, the collapse of trust. They imagined their families watching the news, their careers burning to ashes in front of the world. Their faces drained of all color, their arrogance replaced by desperation. The old lady, however, remained calm. She knew the world was now watching. She knew her humiliation had become a lesson far greater than the walls of this bank. And yet, she still hadn't made her final move. She still hadn't opened her mouth to deliver the judgment everyone feared. Would she forgive them? Would she destroy them? Would she hand their fates over to the furious public outside? Her silence was deafening. And as the tension reached its peak, she finally lifted her gaze, her lips parting ever so slightly, ready to speak for the first time since her humiliation began. The bank lobby was suffocating with silence. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the old lady who had just endured humiliation, cruelty, and rejection within these very walls. A moment ago, she had been dismissed as worthless, pushed to the ground like dust beneath their feet. Now, she stood at the center of the room like a queen before her subjects, holding the power to alter every life inside. Her lips parted slightly, and the first words rolled out, not sharp, not loud, but calm, steady, and piercing enough to freeze the blood in everyone's veins. She spoke of dignity, of compassion, of the values that had been forgotten in the blind chase for appearances. She reminded them that the true measure of humanity is not how one treats the wealthy or the powerful, but how one treats the weak and the vulnerable. Her voice, though frail with age, carried the weight of decades. Every sentence cut deeper than the last, each word a mirror forcing the staff and customers to see themselves for what they had become. They shifted uncomfortably, guilt spreading across their faces like a shadow that could not be shaken off. The regional director stood silently at her side, his head slightly bowed, his respect for her undeniable. The staff who had mocked her only moments before now wished to disappear into the walls. The guard who had shoved her trembled, his pride shattered, his strength meaningless. And the teller who had sneered at her clothes could no longer raise his eyes, his arrogance drowned in shame. Then came the moment they had all dreaded, the judgment. She opened the second folder of documents once more. The crisp pages contained her authority as the founding owner, as the one who could hire and fire, who could build and destroy. Slowly, she began reading the names written within, names of those who had shown cruelty, arrogance, and disrespect. Each name spoken aloud felt like a hammer striking the silence. The teller's name. The guard's name. The manager's name. One by one, their futures crumbled before their eyes. Termination notices, effective immediately. Their careers were over, their reputations shattered, their arrogance punished. The crowd gasped, realizing that justice had not just arrived, it had arrived swiftly, decisively, and without mercy. But then, in a twist no one expected, her eyes softened. She looked upon the rest of the staff, those who had remained silent but complicit, those who had done nothing to stop the cruelty. To them, she offered not destruction but a warning. She would allow them to remain, but under one condition, that they learn, that they change, that they never again allow greed and arrogance to blind them to humanity. The lesson struck harder than the firings. Because it was not just a punishment, it was a chance for redemption. A chance to prove that they had learned the truth of that day. Outside the bank, the crowd had grown. Cameras rolled, microphones extended, voices demanded answers. The video of the old lady being thrown out had already gone viral. The world was watching, waiting for her words, her decision, her judgment. And so, she stepped outside. The doors of the bank opened, and the light of the day fell upon her like a spotlight. The crowd fell silent as she appeared, fragile in body yet towering in presence. Reporters shouted questions, the people whispered, but she raised her hand, and silence returned. She spoke not of revenge, not of power, but of humility. She told the world what had happened, that she had walked into the bank disguised as an ordinary poor woman, seeking nothing but help, and had been treated with cruelty. She explained that she had revealed her true identity not for pride, but for a lesson, that appearances deceive, and arrogance blinds. Her words spread like fire. Within hours, headlines screamed across the nation. Bank owner humiliated by her own staff. Wealthy woman exposes cruelty in disguise. Social media erupted, not only with outrage at the staff but with deep reflection. People began to question their own actions, their own judgments, their own hearts. The staff who had mocked her were remembered not for their careers, but for their cruelty. Their names became warnings of arrogance, whispered with scorn. And the old lady herself became a symbol, a reminder to the world that true wealth is not counted in gold or property, but in kindness, respect, and humanity. As the sun began to set that evening, the bank doors closed, but the story had only just begun. Across the world, millions watched her video, shared her story, and repeated her words. Strangers wrote messages of support, families spoke of the lesson at dinner tables, and societies reflected on the danger of judging others by appearance alone. Inside her small, simple home, the old lady sat by the window, her worn bag resting beside her. She looked out at the city with calm eyes, knowing she had changed it forever. She had not sought revenge, but she had delivered justice. She had not asked for respect, but she had earned it in the truest way. And as the night fell, one truth became undeniable. Those who had once laughed at her would never laugh again. Her silence had shaken an empire. Her humility had taught a nation. And her lesson would echo across generations. This was not just the story of a poor old lady in shabby clothes. It was the story of power hidden in plain sight, of arrogance exposed, and of humanity reclaimed. And for those who witnessed it, whether inside that bank or through the screens of the world, one thought burned in their hearts. What if the next person I judge is not what they seem? What if the poor face before me carries a story I cannot see? The answer was clear. Kindness costs nothing. Arrogance can cost everything. And that is the truth that shocked the world.